The coffee mug trembled slightly in Sarah Mitchell's hands as she stood outside room 237, the familiar weight of her worn leather messenger bag pulling at her shoulder. Through the frosted glass window, she could hear the chaos brewing inside. Chairs scraping against linoleum, voices raised in animated conversation, and the unmistakable sound of paper airplanes being launched across the classroom. At 34, Sarah had walked into dozens of classrooms as a substitute teacher, but something about Riverside High School's advanced placement students always made her stomach clench with anticipation. She adjusted her oversized cardigan, a deliberate choice that made her appear smaller and less threatening than she actually was, and pushed a strand of mousy brown hair behind her ear. The wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose completed the look she'd cultivated over years of substituting. Harmless, forgettable, easily dismissed. It was a costume she wore well, perhaps too well. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with blue lockers and motivational posters that had seen better days. October sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors where sneakers squeaked and locker doors slammed in the familiar rhythm of teenage urgency. Sarah took a deep breath, tasting the unique cocktail of industrial cleaner, cafeteria food, and adolescent energy that permeated every high school in America. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's fingers found the cold metal of the door handle, and for a moment she hesitated. Inside room 237, 28 of Riverside High's most academically gifted seniors waited with the kind of restless energy that came from knowing they were smarter than most adults they encountered. These weren't the struggling students who acted out from frustration or the class clowns seeking attention. These were the future valedictorians, the national merit scholars, the ones destined for Ivy League schools who had learned that intellectual superiority often translated into social dominance. The absence of their beloved Mr. Peterson, who had taught advanced placement English literature at Riverside for 15 years, created a power vacuum that Sarah knew would be filled by the strongest personalities in the room. Peterson was one of those rare teachers who commanded respect through genuine expertise and caring mentorship. His sudden illness had left behind not just lesson plans, but an expectation that whoever walked through that door would measure up to his standards. Sarah had read his notes, studied his curriculum, and prepared extensively for this week-long assignment, but she also knew that preparation meant nothing if she couldn't establish authority in those crucial first moments. She pressed her ear to the door, listening to the conversations that painted a picture of the social hierarchy within. One voice rose above the others, confident, commanding, with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being heard. That would be Jake Thompson, according to the seating chart and notes Peterson had left behind. Senior class president, captain of the debate team, and according to the warnings scribbled in the margins of Peterson's notes, a student who tests boundaries with substitute teachers. Next to Jake's voice, she could hear the higher pitch of Emma Rodriguez, his girlfriend and social media queen of Riverside High. Emma's Instagram account boasted nearly 10,000 followers, most of them fellow students who hung on her every post about fashion, relationships, and the daily dramas of suburban teenage life. Her laughter had a practiced quality, designed to draw attention and signal to others when something was worth noticing. Tyler Brooks contributed a steady stream of commentary that kept the room entertained, the kind of quick-witted observations that made him popular with both students and teachers who appreciated his humor. But Sarah had learned to be wary of class clowns when they sensed weakness. Their jokes could turn cutting faster than most people realized. Madison Clark's voice carried the particular cadence of someone live streaming or recording for social media, probably capturing the pre-class chaos for her TikTok followers. In a world where everything was content, Sarah knew that her first few minutes in that classroom might end up broadcast to hundreds of strangers, dissected and mocked by people who would never understand the complexity of managing a classroom. Full of teenagers who had already decided you weren't worth their respect. The wooden door felt solid beneath her palm as she finally turned the handle, but her reflection in the frosted glass showed exactly what these students would see. A middle-aged woman in an ill-fitting cardigan, clutching a coffee mug like a security blanket, about to walk into a room where she would be outnumbered 28-1 by some of the sharpest young minds in Ohio. Sarah had learned long ago that substitute teaching was less about education and more about survival. The lesson plans were secondary to the primary challenge of lasting through 6 periods without losing control, breaking down, or giving the regular teacher a classroom full of discipline problems to address upon their return. Some substitutes managed through strict authoritarianism, others through friendship and relatability. Sarah had discovered a third path, invisibility and strategic underestimation, that served her well in most circumstances. But as she stepped across the threshold into room 237, breathing in the familiar scent of whiteboard markers and teenage rebellion, she wondered if her usual approach would be enough for this particular group of students. The morning light, streaming through the tall windows, illuminated faces that turned toward her, with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to open disdain, and she could practically see the calculations happening behind their eyes as they sized up their temporary authority figure. The classroom itself reflected Peterson's 15 years of dedication. Walls covered with quotes from literary giants, student artwork inspired by classic novels, and carefully curated book displays that spoke to someone who genuinely loved teaching literature. His desk, which Sarah would occupy for the next week, held personal touches that reminded everyone of his absence. A coffee mug with "World's Greatest Teacher" printed in fading letters, family photos positioned to face both him and his students, and a small, succulent plant that someone would need to water while he recovered. Sarah set her own coffee mug on the desk with deliberate care, the soft clink of ceramic against wood somehow loud in the expectant silence that had fallen over the room. 28 pairs of eyes watched her every movement, cataloging details they would later use to craft their strategies for the week ahead. She could feel their assessment like a physical weight, the way her cardigan hung loose around her shoulders, how her hands shook slightly as she opened her bag, the uncertainty in her movements as she tried to navigate Peterson's organizational system. Jake Thompson lounged in his seat near the back of the room, his posture deliberately casual in the way that communicated confidence to his peers. His Letterman jacket hung over the back of his chair, a visual reminder of his status as both academic and athletic achiever. The easy smile that had helped him win class president played at the corners of his mouth as he watched Sarah fumble with Peterson's lesson plan binder, clearly enjoying the show. Emma Rodriguez sat beside him, her phone discreetly positioned to capture whatever was about to unfold. Her perfectly straightened hair caught the morning light, and her outfit, carefully curated to walk the line between school dress code compliance and Instagram worthiness, marked her as someone who understood the power of image. She whispered something to Madison Clark in the seat behind her, both girls giggling in a way that made Sarah's cheeks burn with premature embarrassment. Tyler Brooks had turned his desk to face the front more directly, the better to provide commentary for whatever entertainment was about to begin. His reputation as the class comedian meant that his reactions would influence how the rest of the room responded to Sarah's attempts at teaching. If he decided she was worth mocking, others would follow his lead. If he grew bored, the room's energy would shift toward more disruptive activities. Near the front of the classroom, Rachel Kim sat with her hands folded and her notebook already open, a small island of genuine academic interest in a sea of social posturing. Her quiet demeanor and serious expression suggested someone who actually cared about learning, regardless of who was teaching. Sarah made a mental note to use Rachel as an ally if the situation deteriorated, knowing that sometimes one engaged student could help stabilize an entire class. The wall clock above the whiteboard ticked steadily toward the official start of third period, each second stretching with the weight of anticipation. Sarah knew that these first few minutes would determine whether she spent the week teaching literature or simply trying to maintain order. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The students knew it too, which was why the room hummed with the particular energy that preceded either breakthrough or breakdown. She cleared her throat softly, a sound that somehow managed to make her appear even more uncertain. And 28. Teenagers leaned forward slightly in their seats, ready for the show to begin. None of them could have imagined what they were actually about to witness, or how completely their assumptions about the nervous woman in the oversized cardigan were about to be shattered. In 30 seconds, everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and the person standing at the front of their classroom would change forever. But first, Sarah Mitchell had a role to play. The role of a substitute teacher who was exactly what she appeared to be, nothing more and nothing less than another adult who had wandered into their domain and would either earn their cooperation or become their entertainment for the next 50 minutes. She picked up a piece of chalk with fingers that trembled just enough to be noticeable and began to write her name on the board in handwriting that looked appropriately uncertain. The tremor in her hand was perfect. Not so dramatic as to seem fake, but visible enough to signal weakness to a room full of predators who had been trained since kindergarten to identify and exploit the vulnerabilities of the adults supposedly in charge of their education. As the chalk scratched against the blackboard, forming letters that wavered slightly under the pressure of 28 stares, Sarah Mitchell began the performance that would either make or break her week at Riverside High School. What none of these brilliant, ambitious, ruthlessly perceptive teenagers realized was that Sarah Mitchell had been performing her entire adult life, and this particular role, nervous substitute teacher in over her head, was just one of many she had mastered. Over the years, the real question wasn't whether she could handle a room full of AP students. It was whether they were prepared to handle her when she finally decided to drop the act. Sarah finished writing her name on the board and turned to face the class, her smile wavering like someone who had practiced it in the mirror but couldn't quite make it convincing under pressure. The silence that greeted her stretched uncomfortably long, broken only by the soft buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a lawnmower working its way across the school's front grounds. She clutched the lesson plan binder against her chest like armor, the worn edges and dog-eared pages testament to Peterson's years of careful preparation. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice carrying just the right note of uncertainty. "I'm Miss Mitchell, and I'll be your substitute teacher while Mr. Peterson recovers from his illness." The words came out slightly rushed, as if she were hurrying through them before losing her nerve entirely. A few students exchanged glances, those silent communications that teenagers had perfected into an art form. Jake Thompson shifted in his seat, the movement deliberate and calculated to draw attention. "So what's your background, Ms. Mitchell?" he asked, his tone polite enough to avoid immediate correction, but carrying an undertone that suggested he was probing for weaknesses. "Have you taught AP literature before?" Sarah's grip tightened on the binder, her knuckles whitening slightly. "Well, I have my teaching certificate, of course, and I've done quite a bit of substituting around the district." She paused, pushing her glasses up her nose in a gesture that seemed nervous rather than habitual. I studied English in college, though that was some time ago. The admission hung in the air like blood in shark-infested waters. Emma Rodriguez's perfectly glossed lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, while Tyler Brooks leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who had just discovered a secret. Madison Clark's phone shifted slightly, probably capturing Sarah's uncertain expression for later commentary. "What college?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the same deceptively sweet tone she used in student council meetings when she wanted to dismantle someone's proposal without appearing openly hostile. "And what did you do before teaching?" Sarah's hand moved to her throat, fidgeting with the small pearl necklace that completed her carefully constructed image. "I went to Millbrook Community College," she said, naming the local institution that most of these students would view as a backup plan for those who couldn't get into real universities. "And I've done various things over the years: retail, some office work, a bit of tutoring here and there." The collective assessment was almost audible. These students, who were already researching Ivy League schools and planning graduate programs before they'd even finished high school, looked at her resume and found it wanting. Rachel Kim maintained her respectful attention, but even she seemed to deflate slightly at the revelation that their substitute lacked the impressive credentials they were accustomed to from their teachers. "So you've never actually taught this curriculum before?" Jake pressed, leaning forward with the persistence of someone accustomed to getting answers. His debate team training showed in the way he structured his questions, each one building on the previous response to create a complete picture. "Mr. Peterson left very detailed lesson plans," Sarah replied, holding up the binder as if it were a shield. "I've reviewed them thoroughly, and I'm confident we can continue your studies without missing a beat." But her voice betrayed her, cracking slightly on the word confident in a way that suggested anything but certainty. Tyler Brooks couldn't resist the opening. "So basically you're reading us someone else's homework," he said, his comment drawing chuckles from several corners of the room. The joke wasn't particularly clever, but it didn't need to be. It was the kind of observation that crystallized everyone's thinking and gave them permission to view their substitute as inadequate. Sarah's cheeks flushed pink, the color spreading down her neck in the way that marked someone unaccustomed to public speaking or confrontation. "I prefer to think of it as following a proven curriculum," she said weakly, but the damage was done. The power dynamic in the room had shifted decisively, and everyone could feel it. Madison Clark raised her hand with exaggerated politeness. "Ms. Mitchell, are you familiar with the symbolic significance of the green light in The Great Gatsby? Because that's what we were discussing yesterday, and Mr. Peterson said we'd be diving deeper into Fitzgerald's use of color symbolism today." The question was a trap, and everyone in the room knew it. Madison's tone suggested genuine academic interest, but her eyes sparkled with the anticipation of someone about to watch their victim walk into a carefully laid snare. The silence stretched as Sarah flipped through Peterson's notes, clearly searching for the answer rather than drawing from her own knowledge. "Well," Sarah began, her voice taking on the particular cadence of someone reading from prepared material. "According to Mr. Peterson's notes, the green light represents Gatsby's yearning for the American dream and his impossible desire to recapture the past." She looked up, hopefully, as if seeking approval for regurgitating the standard interpretation. "But what about the broader implications of green as a symbol of money and corruption in the novel?" Emma interjected, her question delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had already read the SparkNotes summary and was prepared to demonstrate her intellectual superiority. "Don't you think Fitzgerald was making a more sophisticated commentary about the relationship between wealth and moral decay?" Sarah's panic was becoming visible now, small beads of perspiration forming along her hairline despite the cool October morning. She fumbled through more pages, clearly out of her depth, when asked to engage with the material beyond Peterson's prepared talking points. That's an interesting interpretation, she managed, the response of someone desperately buying time while hoping the conversation would move in a different direction. The students could smell the fear now, that particular scent that marked someone who had lost control of their classroom before the real teaching had even begun. Jake and his friends exchanged the kind of meaningful looks that preceded coordinated action, while even the more academically minded students began to sense the shift in authority that often preceded classroom chaos. "Ms. Mitchell," Rachel Kim said softly, her voice carrying genuine concern rather than malice. "Would you like me to help explain the symbolism we've been working on? I took really good notes from yesterday's discussion." The offer was kind, but it also highlighted Sarah's inadequacy in a way that cut deeper than any direct mockery. Here was a 17-year-old student offering to teach the teacher, to fill in the gaps that were becoming more obvious with each passing moment. Sarah's grateful smile only emphasized how far she had fallen from the position of authority she was supposed to occupy. "That would be wonderful, Rachel," Sarah said, her relief audible as she essentially handed control of the classroom to one of her students. "Why don't you share what you learned yesterday, and then we can build on that foundation." As Rachel began to speak, offering a sophisticated analysis of Fitzgerald's symbolism that clearly demonstrated the difference between her preparation and Sarah's, the balance of power in room 237 completed its shift. The substitute teacher had revealed herself to be exactly what the students had suspected, someone who was in over her head, trying to manage a curriculum she didn't understand for students who were already beyond her intellectual reach. But what none of them realized, as they savored their victory over another inadequate adult, was that Sarah Mitchell's educational background was the least interesting thing about her. Her real credentials weren't listed on any resume, couldn't be found in any college transcript, and certainly weren't reflected in her nervous fumbling through Peterson's lesson plans. The truth about who Sarah Mitchell really was, and what she was truly capable of, remained hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed vulnerability that had fooled far more dangerous audiences than a classroom full of teenagers. The next morning brought with it the crisp scent of autumn leaves and the kind of grey October sky that made Riverside High School's fluorescent lighting seem even more harsh and unforgiving. Sarah arrived early, her beat-up Honda Civic pulling into the visitor parking space she'd been assigned for the week, the engine making the subtle, rattling sound that suggested major repairs in the near future. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, watching other teachers arrive in their newer vehicles, many of them carrying travel mugs from expensive coffee shops and designer bags that spoke to salaries significantly higher than what substitute teachers earned. The contrast wasn't lost on her, nor was it accidental. Everything about Sarah Mitchell's presentation was designed to reinforce the image of someone who had ended up in substitute teaching not by choice, but by circumstance. Her car, her clothes, her apparent lack of confidence, all of it painted a picture of someone who had somehow failed to achieve the success that surrounded her. Inside the building, the morning energy was different from the previous day. Word had spread through the complex social networks of high school students with the speed that only teenage gossip could achieve. Sarah Mitchell, the substitute in Peterson's AP literature class, was a pushover. She didn't know the material, couldn't handle challenging questions, and had essentially let the students run the class by the end of the period. For Jake Thompson and his circle, this information represented opportunity. Room 237 felt different too, charged with the anticipation that preceded a planned disruption. The students filed in with the casual confidence of people who had already established their dominance and were prepared to expand upon it. Jake's entrance was particularly theatrical, his Letterman jacket draped over his shoulders and his backpack slung with the kind of careless ease that suggested he owned not just his seat but the entire classroom. "Morning, Miss Mitchell," he said, his greeting carrying just enough respect to avoid immediate correction while somehow managing to sound condescending. "Ready for another exciting day of literature?" Sarah looked up from her desk, where she'd been arranging papers with the kind of nervous precision that suggested she'd been there for quite some time, preparing for a day she clearly dreaded. "Good morning, Jake," she replied, her voice carrying the forced cheer of someone determined to start fresh despite yesterday's challenges. "I think you'll find today's lesson quite engaging." Emma Rodriguez settled into her seat with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to being watched, her phone already positioned to capture whatever entertainment was about to unfold. Her outfit had been chosen with the same strategic thinking that governed her social media presence. Camera ready, but within dress code, designed to project an image of effortless perfection that her followers had come to expect. "What are we covering today?" Tyler Brooks asked, his question seemingly innocent, but delivered with the timing of someone who had already decided that whatever answer he received would become the foundation for his comedy routine. His reputation as the class entertainer meant that his reactions would set the tone for how the rest of the room responded to Sarah's attempts at teaching. Sarah consulted Peterson's lesson plan with the studied attention of someone following a recipe for a dish she'd never prepared before. "We're going to explore the theme of social class in The Great Gatsby," she announced, her voice gaining strength as she moved into prepared material. "Mr. Peterson has outlined some really fascinating discussion points about how Fitzgerald portrays the American dream." Madison Clark's hand shot up with the eagerness of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opening. "Ms. Mitchell, I did some research last night, and I found some really interesting critical essays about that topic. Should I share what I learned?" The offer sounded helpful, but everyone in the room understood the subtext. Madison was positioning herself as more knowledgeable than the teacher, setting up a dynamic where the students would be educating the supposed educator. Sarah's grateful acceptance of the offer only confirmed what had been established the day before. She was out of her depth and grateful for any assistance, even from the people she was supposed to be instructing. "That would be wonderful, Madison," Sarah said, already stepping back from her position of authority. "Why don't you share your findings with the class?" As Madison launched into a presentation that she'd clearly prepared specifically to demonstrate her superiority over the substitute teacher, Sarah found herself relegated to the role of facilitator rather than instructor. She nodded along enthusiastically, occasionally interjecting with comments like, "That's a great point," or "I hadn't thought of it that way," each response further cementing her position as the least knowledgeable person in the room. Jake watched this performance with the calculating attention of someone planning his next move. The previous day had established that Sarah could be easily intimidated and overwhelmed, but today presented an opportunity to push those boundaries further. The key was to maintain enough plausible deniability to avoid serious consequences while systematically undermining her authority. "Ms. Mitchell," he said when Madison had finished her impromptu lecture, "I'm curious about your interpretation of the class dynamics in the novel. Do you think Fitzgerald was making any commentary about educational hierarchies?" The question was layered with meaning that went far beyond literary analysis. Jake was essentially asking Sarah to comment on her own inadequacy, to analyze the very power dynamics that were playing out in their classroom through the lens of the novel they were supposed to be studying. It was the kind of sophisticated psychological manipulation that debate team training had taught him to execute with surgical precision. Sarah's pause stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. her eyes darting between Peterson's notes and Jake's expectant expression. "Well," she began hesitantly, "I think Fitzgerald was certainly interested in how social positions affect relationships between characters. But don't you think he was also exploring how education and intellectual capacity create their own forms of class distinction?" Emma added, her question building on Jake's foundation with the seamless coordination of people who had planned this interaction. "I mean, some characters in the novel clearly have access to better education and cultural knowledge than others. The parallel to their current classroom situation was unmistakable, and the students began to understand that they were witnessing something more sophisticated than simple teenage rebellion." Jake and Emma were systematically deconstructing Sarah's authority using the very material she was supposed to be teaching, turning the lesson into a real-time demonstration of the educational hierarchies they were discussing. Rachel Kim shifted uncomfortably in her seat, recognizing the cruelty of what was unfolding, but uncertain how to intervene without making herself a target. Her genuine interest in learning was being overshadowed by the power games her classmates were playing, and she could see how each seemingly academic question was actually designed to highlight Sarah's inadequacy. "That's a really sophisticated analysis," Sarah said, her voice carrying the forced enthusiasm of someone who knew she was being manipulated but couldn't figure out how to regain control. "You've clearly given this a lot of thought." Tyler Brooks sensed the shift in the room's energy and decided to escalate with his particular brand of humor. "Maybe we should have Emma teach the class, Ms. Mitchell. She seems to have done more preparation than some people." The comment drew laughter from several students, the kind of appreciative response that encouraged further performance. Sarah's cheeks flushed again, but this time the color was accompanied by something else, a tightening around her eyes that suggested anger was beginning to mix with embarrassment. "I appreciate everyone's enthusiasm for the material," she said, her voice slightly strained, "but let's try to focus on the lesson plan Mr. Peterson prepared for us." "Of course," Jake said smoothly, his tone perfectly respectful while his eyes sparkled with mischief. "We wouldn't want to deviate from the plan. After all, you're following it so carefully." The comment was delivered with just enough ambiguity to avoid being clearly disrespectful, but everyone in the room understood the implication. Sarah was nothing more than a script reader, someone following instructions without the knowledge or confidence to adapt or improvise. The systematic dismantling of her authority was proceeding exactly as Jake had planned, with each exchange further establishing the students' intellectual superiority over their supposed teacher. But as Sarah returned to Peterson's lesson plan, her hands slightly steadier than they had been moments before, none of the students noticed the subtle change in her posture. The tremor that had marked her nervousness the day before was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like anticipation. As if she were waiting for something, counting down to a moment that only she knew was coming. The morning light streaming through the classroom windows caught the edge of her glasses as she looked down at the lesson plan. And for just an instant, her expression shifted into something that didn't match the image of inadequacy she'd been projecting. It was the look of someone who had been underestimated before, someone who knew exactly how this story would end, even if everyone else in the room was still reading the opening chapters. Jake Thompson had been running Riverside High School's social ecosystem since his sophomore year, when his combination of athletic ability, academic achievement, and natural charisma had elevated him from promising underclassman to undisputed leader of his peer group. Now, as a senior with early admission to Northwestern already secured, he operated with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a challenge he couldn't overcome, or an adult he couldn't charm or manipulate when necessary. His approach to substitute teachers had been refined over years of practice, developed through careful observation of what worked and what didn't when faced with temporary authority figures. The key, he'd learned, was to maintain plausible deniability while systematically testing boundaries. Direct confrontation brought administrative consequences, but sophisticated psychological pressure applied with surgical precision could reduce even experienced educators to nervous wrecks without providing grounds for formal discipline. Emma Rodriguez complemented Jake's intellectual approach with her mastery of social dynamics and image management. Her Instagram influence extended far beyond Riverside High, making her a valuable ally for anyone seeking to control narrative and perception. When Emma decided someone was worth mocking, the ridicule could spread across multiple platforms and social networks with devastating efficiency. Her relationship with Jake wasn't just romantic, it was a strategic partnership between two people who understood power and weren't afraid to use it. Tyler Brooks brought a different skill set to their group, one that proved invaluable when dealing with adults who took themselves too seriously. His reputation as the class comedian provided cover for comments that might otherwise be seen as disrespectful, allowing him to push boundaries under the guise of harmless entertainment. Teachers who tried to discipline him for his jokes often found themselves appearing humorless and rigid, while Tyler emerged as the sympathetic victim of adult overreaction. Madison Clark completed their core group with her technical expertise and her understanding of how teenage social media culture could be weaponized. Her TikTok following might have been smaller than Emma's Instagram audience, but her content was specifically designed to go viral among high school students. A well-timed video mocking a substitute teacher could spread through the district's student body within hours, creating a reputation that would follow that teacher to every subsequent assignment. Together, they had perfected the art of collaborative intimidation, each member playing their role in a system designed to establish dominance over any adult foolish enough to enter their territory without proper credentials or preparation. They had driven substitute teachers to tears, to early departures, and in one memorable case, to a complete nervous breakdown that resulted in an ambulance being called to the school. The morning of Sarah's second day presented them with what they recognized as an ideal target. Her performance the previous day had revealed every weakness they needed to exploit. Inadequate preparation, lack of subject matter expertise, visible nervousness under pressure, and most importantly, a desperate need for approval that made her vulnerable to manipulation disguised as academic engagement. Jake's opening gambit had been perfectly executed, using sophisticated literary analysis to mask what was essentially an interrogation designed to expose Sarah's intellectual limitations. Emma's follow-up questions had built on that foundation, creating a pattern that would allow them to systematically deconstruct Sarah's authority while appearing to be model students engaging with the curriculum. "You know what I think would be really educational," Madison said, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when introducing ideas that she'd already decided to implement regardless of adult approval. "Maybe we could record some of our discussions about the novel, like for study purposes. I bet other students would find it really helpful to see how advanced classes analyze literature." The suggestion was delivered with enough educational justification to make objection difficult, but everyone in the room understood the real purpose. Madison wanted to capture Sarah's inadequacy on video, creating content that could be shared, commented on, and used to establish a reputation that would follow the substitute teacher throughout the district. Sarah's hesitation was visible, her eyes darting between Madison's expectant expression and the phones that several other students were already positioning more obviously on their desks. "I'm not sure that's necessary," she said finally, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who knew she was walking into a trap but couldn't figure out how to avoid it. "Oh, but it would be so helpful," Emma added, her tone suggesting genuine academic interest while her eyes sparkled with anticipation. "Especially for students who might be struggling with the material. We could create like a peer tutoring resource." Tyler Brooks couldn't resist adding his contribution to the pressure campaign. "Come on, Miss Mitchell, don't you want to help? Students learn. I thought that's what teaching was all about." His comment drew appreciative chuckles from several classmates, the kind of response that encouraged further performance. The beauty of their approach was its superficial reasonableness. How could a teacher object to students wanting to create educational content? How could someone in Sarah's position refuse a request that was framed in terms of helping other students succeed? They had trapped her between her obvious inadequacy and her supposed commitment to education, creating a situation where any response would further undermine her authority. Jake watched Sarah's internal struggle with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully engineered exactly the reaction he wanted. Her desperation to appear competent and helpful would force her to agree to being recorded, providing them with permanent evidence of her failures that could be shared, edited, and repurposed for maximum humiliation, I suppose. "If it would really help other students," Sarah said finally, her surrender accompanied by the kind of resigned sigh that marked someone who had run out of options. "But let's make sure we stay focused on the educational content." Madison's smile was radiant as she positioned her phone more prominently, adjusting the angle to capture both Sarah's nervous expressions and her own confident performance. "Absolutely, Ms. Mitchell. This is going to be so educational." The other students began arranging themselves strategically, some positioning their own devices to capture different angles, while others prepared to contribute comments and questions designed to highlight the contrast between their preparation and Sarah's obvious inadequacy. Rachel Kim looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction things were taking, but her quiet nature prevented her from speaking up against the coordinated effort unfolding around her. "So," Jake said, settling back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who had successfully set his trap and was now preparing to spring it, "why don't we start with your analysis of the significance of Gatsby's parties? I'm really curious to hear your interpretation of how Fitzgerald uses those scenes to comment on American society." The question was delivered with perfect academic tone, but everyone in the room understood that they were about to witness a systematic destruction of Sarah Mitchell's credibility, captured in high definition for posterity and viral distribution. As Sarah opened Peterson's lesson plan once again, searching for guidance on a topic she clearly hadn't prepared to discuss in depth, the students leaned forward in anticipation of the performance they were about to witness. But as Sarah began to speak, consulting her notes with the nervous attention of someone clearly out of her depth, none of them noticed the subtle change in her breathing pattern. The shallow, nervous respirations that had marked her anxiety were being replaced by something deeper, more controlled, like someone who was preparing for action rather than surrender. The moment that would later be remembered as the beginning of the end started with what seemed like a simple question about homework assignments. Jake Thompson had spent his lunch period coordinating with Emma and Tyler, planning their afternoon assault on Sarah's remaining credibility with the precision of a military operation. They had identified her weakest points from the morning session and developed a strategy designed to exploit each vulnerability while maintaining their cover as concerned students seeking clarification on academic matters. "Ms. Mitchell," Jake began as the class settled in for fifth period, his voice carrying the tone of someone raising a legitimate concern, "I'm a little confused about the essay assignment Mr. Peterson gave us before he left. Could you clarify exactly what he wants us to focus on?" Sarah looked down at Peterson's notes, her finger tracing the handwritten instructions, while 28 pairs of eyes watched her struggle to interpret another teacher's organizational system. The assignment was clearly outlined in Peterson's careful script, but Sarah's visible uncertainty about how to explain it created exactly the opening Jake had been hoping for. "Well," she began hesitantly, "it looks like he wants you to analyze the symbolism in chapters 7 through 9, focusing on how Fitzgerald uses imagery to develop his themes." She looked up hopefully, as if seeking confirmation that her interpretation was correct. Emma leaned forward with the expression of someone genuinely seeking understanding, though her phone remained positioned to capture every moment of the interaction. "But Ms. Mitchell, yesterday you said symbolism was about the green light and money, and now you're talking about imagery. Are those the same thing? Because I want to make sure I understand what you're looking for." The question was perfectly crafted to highlight Sarah's inconsistency while appearing to seek clarification. Emma's tone suggested genuine academic concern, but her eyes sparkled with the anticipation of someone who had just cornered their prey. The rest of the class sensed the shift in energy, that particular tension that preceded either breakthrough or breakdown. Sarah's flush was immediate and visible, the color spreading across her cheeks as she realized she'd been caught in the kind of contradiction that revealed her superficial understanding of the material. "Well, symbolism and imagery are related concepts," she said weakly, clearly unsure of the distinction herself. "They both involve literary devices that authors use to convey meaning." Tyler Brooks couldn't resist the opening. "So basically, everything in literature is a literary device?" he asked, his comment drawing appreciative laughter from his classmates. "That's super helpful, Ms. Mitchell. Really clarifies things for us." The laughter hit Sarah like a physical blow, her grip tightening on Peterson's lesson plan as she struggled to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her ability to manage. Madison Clark's phone captured every moment of her discomfort, the high-definition video preserving her humiliation for later editing and distribution. Let's just focus on what Mr. Peterson wants you to analyze," Sarah said, her voice taking on the desperate quality of someone trying to redirect attention away from their obvious inadequacy. "He's outlined some specific passages that he thinks are particularly significant." Jake sensed victory and pressed his advantage with the ruthless efficiency that had made him captain of the debate team. "But Ms. Mitchell, how can we analyze passages if we don't understand the analytical framework you want us to use? I mean, if you can't explain the difference between symbolism and imagery, how are we supposed to write essays that meet your expectations?" The question was devastating in its apparent reasonableness. Jake was simply asking for clarification on academic standards, the kind of request that any dedicated student might make. But everyone in the room understood that he was actually demanding that Sarah demonstrate knowledge she clearly didn't possess, forcing her to choose between admitting ignorance and attempting an explanation that would likely reveal even greater inadequacy. Sarah's pause stretched long enough to become excruciating, the silence broken only by the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of other classes proceeding normally throughout the building. Finally, she spoke with the defeated tone of someone who had run out of options. "You know what?" she said, her voice slightly shaky. "Why don't you all just work on whatever you think Mr. Peterson would want? I'm sure you understand his expectations better than I do." The surrender was complete and public, witnessed by 28 students and captured in multiple video recordings that would soon spread throughout Riverside High's social networks. Sarah had essentially admitted that her students knew more about the curriculum than she did, abdicated her role as instructor, and handed control of the classroom to the very people who had systematically destroyed her authority. Emma's smile was radiant as she exchanged glances with Jake, both of them savoring the completeness of their victory. Tyler Brooks was already composing the jokes he would share with friends in other classes, while Madison Clark adjusted her phone angle to capture Sarah's defeated posture as she slumped behind Peterson's desk, like someone who had given up all pretense of being in charge. But even as the students celebrated their triumph over another inadequate adult, Rachel Kim found herself studying Sarah's expression with growing confusion. There was something about the substitute teacher's demeanor that didn't quite match the situation, a subtle quality that suggested someone who was performing defeat rather than genuinely experiencing it. "Ms. Mitchell," Rachel said quietly, her voice carrying genuine concern rather than mockery. "Are you okay? You seem upset." Sarah looked up at Rachel with an expression that was difficult to interpret, something that might have been gratitude, mixed with something else, something that looked almost like anticipation. "I'm fine, Rachel," she said softly, "just trying to figure out how to help everyone learn." Jake sensed an opportunity to deliver the final blow to Sarah's credibility. "Maybe you should call the principal," he suggested with mock helpfulness. "I mean, if you're not comfortable teaching the class, maybe someone else should take over. We don't want to miss important instruction time." The suggestion was delivered with enough apparent concern to avoid seeming openly disrespectful, but everyone understood the implications. Jake was essentially suggesting that Sarah was so incompetent that she should remove herself from the classroom, completing her humiliation by forcing her to admit defeat to the school administration. Madison Clark's phone captured Sarah's reaction to this final insult, recording the moment when the substitute teacher's face went through a series of expressions that would later be analyzed frame by students throughout the district. First, there was the expected flash of hurt and embarrassment, then something that looked like resignation, and finally, for just an instant, something else entirely. It was Tyler Brooks who would later claim he saw it first, though several other students would dispute his account. For just a moment, as Sarah processed Jake's suggestion that she call for help, her expression shifted into something that didn't match the nervous, overwhelmed woman they had been tormenting for 2 days. It was the look of someone who had just heard exactly what they'd been waiting to hear, someone whose patience had finally been rewarded with the perfect opportunity. "You know what, Jake?" Sarah said slowly, her voice taking on a quality that made several students look up from their phones with sudden attention. "I think you're absolutely right. Maybe someone else should take over this classroom." But instead of reaching for the phone to call the principal's office, Sarah Mitchell stood up from behind Peterson's desk with a fluid grace that seemed completely at odds with the nervous, uncertain woman who had been fumbling through lesson plans moments before. As she moved toward the center of the classroom, something fundamental shifted in her posture, her expression, and most noticeably, in the quality of her voice. "In fact," she continued, and now there was no mistaking the change that was occurring, "I think it's time you all met the real Sarah Mitchell." The transformation that began in Sarah Mitchell's voice rippled outward through her entire being like a stone dropped into still water. Her shoulders straightened with military precision, losing the rounded, defensive posture she had maintained for 2 days. The nervous fidgeting with her glasses ceased entirely, replaced by hands that moved with purposeful confidence. Even her breathing changed, becoming deeper and more controlled, the rhythm of someone accustomed to maintaining composure under extreme pressure. What the students couldn't have known, as they watched this metamorphosis with growing confusion, was that Sarah Mitchell possessed credentials that would have made their carefully crafted humiliation attempts seem like children playing dress-up. For 15 years, before she had ever set foot in a classroom as a substitute teacher, she had served as a senior interrogator with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in the psychological manipulation of suspects who believed themselves untouchable. Her training at Quantico had been rigorous beyond anything these privileged teenagers could imagine, involving months of instruction in reading micro-expressions, detecting deception, and most relevantly, maintaining cover identities under intense scrutiny. She had spent years perfecting the art of appearing vulnerable while gathering intelligence, of seeming weak while positioning herself for strategic advantage. The nervous substitute teacher persona was just another role in a repertoire that had helped her break some of the most sophisticated criminal minds in the country. Her specialty had been white-collar criminals, particularly those whose intelligence and education made them believe they were immune to traditional interrogation techniques. Corporate executives who thought their Ivy League degrees made them untouchable. Financial criminals who assumed their sophistication placed them above ordinary law enforcement. And yes, occasionally, privileged young people whose sense of entitlement had led them into serious legal trouble. The techniques she had used to crack billion-dollar fraud cases were the same ones she was now applying to Room 237, though the stakes were admittedly lower. She had allowed Jake and his friends to believe they were controlling the narrative. To think their intellectual superiority gave them power over her, all while gathering intelligence about their personalities, their methods, and most importantly, their psychological weaknesses. Every question they had asked, every taunt they had delivered, every moment of supposed victory they had savored, had provided Sarah with valuable data about how they operated. Jake's need for intellectual dominance, Emma's dependence on social validation, Tyler's reliance on humor as a weapon, Madison's obsession with capturing and controlling narrative through technology. She had catalogued it all with the systematic precision of someone trained to build psychological profiles. The FBI had taught her that the most effective way to defeat sophisticated opponents was to let them reveal themselves completely before making your move. Criminals who thought they were smarter than law enforcement would often confess to crimes that investigators hadn't even suspected, simply because their arrogance compelled them to demonstrate their cleverness. Jake Thompson and his friends had just spent 2 days demonstrating exactly how they operated, showing Sarah every tool in their arsenal while believing they were dealing with someone too incompetent to understand what was happening. Her resignation from the Bureau 3 years earlier had been voluntary, the result of a combination of burnout from dealing with humanity's worst impulses and a desire to find more meaningful work. Education had seemed like a natural transition, a way to use her skills to help young people rather than to prosecute criminals. But the substitute teaching circuit had shown her that many of the same psychological dynamics existed in schools, just with lower stakes and younger participants. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now facing a group of teenagers who were employing many of the same manipulation tactics she had encountered in federal interrogation rooms. The sophisticated psychological pressure, the coordinated approach, the careful maintenance of plausible deniability. It was all remarkably similar to techniques used by criminal organizations, just adapted for the high school environment. But where Jake and his friends had made their crucial error was in assuming that their intelligence and education gave them an insurmountable advantage. They had never encountered someone who had spent years training specifically to deal with people who believed themselves too smart to be caught, too sophisticated to be manipulated, too privileged to face consequences for their actions. Sarah's hand moved to her throat, but instead of the nervous fidgeting gesture the students had observed for 2 days, she calmly removed the small pearl necklace that had completed her costume. Underneath, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a thin scar that ran along her collarbone, a souvenir from a case involving arms dealers who had nearly discovered her true identity before she could complete her mission. The wire-rimmed glasses came off next, revealing eyes that were sharper and more penetrating than anyone in room 237 had previously noticed. Without the carefully chosen accessories that had made her appear older and more uncertain, Sarah's face took on a quality that several students would later describe as predatory, though they wouldn't understand why until much later. Her posture continued to evolve as she stood behind Peterson's desk, but now she moved with the contained energy of someone comfortable with authority, someone accustomed to controlling situations rather than being controlled by them. The woman who had fumbled through lesson plans and stumbled over literary analysis was being replaced by someone whose very presence changed the energy of the room. "You've been very instructive," Sarah said, her voice now carrying the kind of calm authority that made people listen without quite understanding why. "For the past 2 days, you've provided me with a comprehensive demonstration of how you operate, how you think, and most importantly, what you believe gives you power." Jake Thompson's confident expression began to show the first cracks of uncertainty. Something fundamental had shifted in the room's dynamic, but he couldn't quite identify what had changed. Sarah looked the same, was standing in the same place, but everything about her felt different in a way that triggered instinctive wariness. Emma Rodriguez lowered her phone slightly, her social media instincts warning her that whatever was happening might not be the kind of content she wanted associated with her online presence. The perfectly curated image she maintained across platforms depended on her being seen as sophisticated and in control, not as someone caught off guard by a situation she hadn't anticipated. Tyler Brooks found himself uncharacteristically quiet, his usual stream of commentary drying up as he processed the change in Sarah's demeanor. Comedy required understanding your audience and your environment, and something about the current situation suggested that his usual approach might not be appropriate. Madison Clark kept her phone recording, but her expression shifted from anticipation to confusion as she realized that the narrative she had expected to capture was transforming into something entirely different. The vulnerable substitute teacher, being destroyed by superior students, was being replaced by something that didn't fit any of her established content categories. Rachel Kim sat forward in her seat, her academic instincts recognizing that whatever was about to happen would be more educational than anything they had covered in Peterson's curriculum. She had sensed something beneath Sarah's surface from the beginning, but now she was finally going to see what had been hidden there. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation has a term for what you've been doing," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a professional assessment. "We call it coordinated psychological manipulation with intent to establish dominance through systematic intimidation. In adult criminal contexts, it's often associated with white-collar crime, organized harassment, and conspiracy charges." The words fell into the silence of room 237 like stones into a deep well, each syllable carrying implications that the students were only beginning to process. Federal Bureau of Investigation, criminal contexts, conspiracy charges, the vocabulary alone suggested that their substitute teacher possessed knowledge and experience that went far beyond anything they had imagined. Jake's face had gone pale, though whether from shock or the dawning realization that he might have seriously misjudged the situation was unclear. Emma's phone was now completely lowered, her social media instincts warning her that whatever was being recorded might not be something she wanted preserved. Tyler and Madison remained frozen, both of them processing the transformation they were witnessing with the stunned attention of people watching a magic trick being revealed. "Of course," Sarah added, with the hint of a smile that didn't reach. Her eyes, in this context, were just talking about high school students who haven't yet learned that intelligence without wisdom can be a dangerous combination. But the psychological principles remain remarkably similar. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of autumn wind rustling the leaves outside room 237's windows. Nature providing a soundtrack for a moment that would later be remembered as the instant when everything changed at Riverside High School. Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still behind Peterson's desk, her transformation complete, but her actions carefully controlled. The woman who had emerged from the nervous substitute teacher disguise possessed the kind of presence that commanded attention, but she wielded that authority with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much force was appropriate for any given situation. Years of FBI training had taught her that the most effective demonstrations of power were often the most restrained ones. The federal regulations governing her conduct hadn't disappeared when she left the bureau. Even as a civilian, even in a high school classroom, she remained bound by principles that prohibited the misuse of her training and experience. She could reveal who she was, could demonstrate the vast gulf between her actual capabilities and the image she had projected. But she could not cross the line into anything that might be considered abuse of her position or excessive use of her skills. More importantly, she had made a personal commitment when she entered education to use her abilities constructively rather than destructively. The teenagers sitting before her, for all their cruelty and arrogance, were still children in the eyes of the law and in her own moral framework. They deserved to learn from this experience, not to be traumatized by it. The lesson she was about to deliver needed to be proportional to their offense and educational in its impact. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She possessed the skills to psychologically destroy Jake Thompson and his friends with surgical precision, to identify and exploit their deepest insecurities and fears with techniques that would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about themselves. She could have turned their own methods against them with an effectiveness that would have been truly devastating, using their recorded confessions of their bullying tactics as evidence of character flaws that would follow them for years. But Sarah Mitchell hadn't become a substitute teacher to wage psychological warfare against teenagers. She had chosen education because she believed in the possibility of transformation, in the idea that even the most privileged and entitled young people could learn empathy and wisdom if the lesson was delivered properly. Her goal wasn't to crush these students, but to give them an experience that would make them think differently about power, respect, and the assumptions they made about other people. The challenge was calibrating her response appropriately. Too little, and they would dismiss what had happened as an anomaly, learning nothing from the experience and potentially becoming more sophisticated in their future bullying attempts. Too much, and she risked crossing ethical lines that she had sworn never to cross, using her professional training in ways that could cause genuine psychological harm to developing minds. She could see the fear beginning to register in their faces as they processed the implications of her revelation. Jake's confidence was evaporating as he realized that his carefully planned psychological manipulation had been turned against him by someone with vastly superior training and experience. Emma was calculating the potential damage to her reputation if word spread that she had been outmaneuvered by a substitute teacher. Tyler and Madison were both reconsidering every interaction they had recorded, wondering what they had actually captured and whether they wanted it to exist. But fear alone wouldn't create the kind of lasting change Sarah wanted to achieve. The students needed to understand not just that they had been wrong about her, but why their behavior had been problematic in the first place. They needed to see the human cost of their actions, to understand how their treatment of someone they perceived as weak and vulnerable reflected on their character and their values. Sarah's training had taught her that the most effective interventions were those that allowed people to reach their own conclusions rather than having lessons imposed upon them. She needed to create a situation where Jake and his friends would recognize the moral implications of their behavior without feeling that they were being lectured or punished. The goal was insight, not humiliation. "I want you to understand something," Sarah said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had served her well in interrogation rooms where billions of dollars and multiple life sentences hung in the balance. "For the past 2 days, you have demonstrated a level of coordinated psychological manipulation that would be impressive if it weren't so thoroughly unethical." She moved from behind the desk with fluid precision, her steps measured and deliberate as she positioned herself where she could make eye contact with each of the primary participants in the campaign against her. The movement wasn't threatening, but it carried an undeniable sense of purpose that made it clear she was no longer operating from a position of weakness. "Jake, your questions were carefully designed to expose what you perceived as intellectual inadequacy while maintaining enough academic legitimacy to avoid disciplinary action. Emma, your social dynamics management and image control were sophisticated enough to amplify the psychological pressure while creating plausible deniability. Tyler, your humor was weaponized to provide social permission for cruelty while positioning yourself as merely entertaining. Madison, your documentation strategy was designed to create permanent evidence of humiliation that could be distributed and monetized. The clinical precision with which she analyzed their methods had a visible impact on each student she named. They were hearing their own tactics described with the kind of professional vocabulary typically reserved for criminal psychology textbooks, and the implications were beginning to sink in. These weren't just pranks or typical teenage behavior. They were sophisticated psychological operations that had been executed with deliberate intent to cause harm. Each of these approaches individually might be dismissed as adolescent testing of boundaries, Sarah continued, her tone remaining perfectly neutral despite the gravity of what she was discussing. But coordinated together, with specific targets selected for perceived vulnerability, they constitute a pattern that law enforcement takes very seriously when encountered in adult contexts. Rachel Kim found herself taking notes, her academic instincts recognizing that she was receiving an education in psychology and human behavior that wasn't available in any textbook. The systematic way Sarah was deconstructing the psychological manipulation she had witnessed was both fascinating and deeply disturbing, particularly as she realized how sophisticated and deliberate the cruelty had been. "But here's what I want you to really understand," Sarah said, and now her voice carried a note of something that might have been sadness mixed with disappointment. "You chose to target someone you believed was weak, vulnerable, and unable to defend herself. You saw what you interpreted as incompetence and intellectual inadequacy, and your first instinct was to attack rather than to help." The words hung in the air like an indictment, forcing each student to confront the moral implications of their actions in a way that mere punishment never could have achieved. Sarah wasn't just criticizing their behavior. She was holding up a mirror that reflected their character in ways they might never have considered. Jake Thompson's face was no longer pale. It was flushed with the kind of shame that came from having your worst qualities exposed and analyzed by someone whose opinion suddenly mattered more than you wanted to admit. Emma's social media instincts were screaming warnings about reputation management, but she was beginning to realize that some kinds of damage couldn't be controlled through careful image curation. Tyler Brooks was experiencing the particular discomfort that comedians felt when they realized their humor had crossed lines they hadn't intended to cross, when entertainment became cruelty without them noticing the transition. Madison Clark was staring at her phone with the expression of someone who had just realized that her recorded evidence might actually be evidence against herself rather than against her target. But Sarah wasn't finished. The lesson she was delivering required one more element, one final component that would transform this from a moment of temporary shame into a lasting change in perspective. "The question you need to ask yourselves," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone presenting a challenge rather than delivering a verdict, "is what this behavior says about who you are and who you want to become." The systematic campaign that Jake Thompson and his allies had waged against Sarah Mitchell over the previous 2 days represented far more than typical teenage testing of authority. As Sarah began to reconstruct their methods with the clinical precision of someone trained in criminal psychology, the scope and sophistication of their coordinated effort became undeniably clear. Each incident, which had seemed spontaneous and reactive in the moment, revealed itself as part of a calculated strategy designed to achieve maximum psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability. The pattern had begun even before Sarah's first day in room 237, with preliminary intelligence gathering that would have impressed professional operatives. Jake had researched her background through the school's substitute teacher database. Emma had checked social media platforms for any digital footprint that might reveal vulnerabilities, and Madison had consulted with students from other schools, where Sarah had previously worked to gather intelligence about her teaching style and areas of weakness. This advanced preparation had allowed them to enter their first interaction with Sarah already knowing her educational background, her apparent lack of experience with advanced placement curricula, and most importantly, her history of avoiding confrontation with difficult students. They had approached their first encounter not as a spontaneous test of boundaries, but as the opening move in a campaign they had already planned to escalate systematically. The initial probing on Sarah's first day had been designed to establish baseline reactions and identify the most effective pressure points for future exploitation. Jake's questions about her credentials hadn't been casual curiosity. They had been specifically chosen to force her to reveal the gaps in her resume that they had already identified through their research. Emma's follow-up inquiries about her college experience had been calculated to highlight the status differential between Sarah's community college background and their own Ivy League aspirations. When Sarah had responded to these initial probes with visible nervousness and defensive explanations, Jake and his team had immediately recognized that they were dealing with someone whose professional confidence was fragile and whose authority could be systematically undermined. The intelligence they gathered during that first-class period had provided the foundation for everything that followed. The second day had seen a significant escalation in both the sophistication of their methods and the coordination of their efforts. The questions about literary analysis hadn't been genuine requests for clarification. They had been carefully constructed traps designed to expose Sarah's surface-level understanding of the curriculum while forcing her to choose between admitting ignorance and attempting explanations that would reveal even greater inadequacy. Emma's social dynamics management had been particularly effective during this phase, using her influence to create a classroom atmosphere where mocking Sarah became socially acceptable and even encouraged. Her subtle signals to other students about when to laugh, when to ask challenging questions, and when to appear sympathetic had orchestrated a group dynamic that amplified the psychological pressure Sarah was experiencing. Tyler's humor had evolved from harmless commentary to pointed ridicule, with each joke carefully timed to maximize Sarah's discomfort while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid direct disciplinary action. His reputation as the class entertainer had provided cover for increasingly cruel observations, allowing him to say things that would have been obviously inappropriate if delivered by someone without his established persona. Madison's documentation strategy had been perhaps the most insidious element of their campaign, transforming Sarah's professional struggles into content that could be shared, edited, and weaponized across multiple platforms. The promise of creating educational content had been nothing more than a pretext for gathering material that could be used to destroy Sarah's reputation throughout the district's substitute teacher network. But the true sophistication of their operation had been revealed in how they had coordinated these individual efforts into a seamless psychological assault that left Sarah with no effective means of defense. When she had tried to rely on lesson plans, they had exposed her inability to adapt or improvise. When she had attempted to establish authority through traditional teacher methods, they had demonstrated that they knew the material better than she did. When she had sought to redirect the class toward productive activities, they had turned even her efforts to help them into evidence of her incompetence. The culmination of their campaign had been the systematic destruction of Sarah's credibility in front of the entire class, captured on multiple recording devices and designed to create permanent documentation of her failure. They had forced her to admit that her students understood the curriculum better than she did, compelled her to abdicate her role as instructor, and finally manipulated her into essentially calling for her own removal from the classroom. Throughout this process, they had maintained careful attention to legal and institutional boundaries, ensuring that none of their individual actions could be characterized as obvious violations of school policy or acceptable student behavior. Their methods had been sophisticated enough to avoid triggering intervention from administrators, while being devastating enough to achieve their goal of establishing complete dominance over their substitute teacher. The beauty of their approach, from a purely tactical perspective, had been its sustainability and its documentation. Unlike physical bullying or obvious verbal abuse, their psychological manipulation could have continued indefinitely without creating grounds for formal discipline. The recorded evidence they had gathered could have been shared throughout the school's social networks, creating a reputation that would have followed Sarah to every subsequent assignment. But as Sarah Mitchell stood before them, no longer hiding, behind the persona of an overwhelmed substitute teacher, Jake and his friends were beginning to understand that they had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had assumed that their intelligence and sophistication gave them an insurmountable advantage over any adult who might enter their domain. They had believed that their careful planning and coordinated execution made them untouchable. What they hadn't considered was the possibility that they might be dealing with someone whose training and experience in psychological manipulation far exceeded their own, someone who had allowed them to reveal the full scope of their capabilities, while gathering intelligence about their methods, their motivations, and most importantly, their weaknesses. The systematic campaign they had waged against Sarah Mitchell was about to become a case study in how quickly psychological dominance could shift when the presumed victim turned out to be a predator who had been hunting much more dangerous prey. For most of her professional life, Rachel Kim had been watching the systematic destruction of Sarah Mitchell with growing discomfort since the campaign began, her natural empathy warring with her social instincts for self-preservation. Unlike many of her classmates who either actively participated in or passively enabled the psychological manipulation, Rachel possessed the kind of moral clarity that made her acutely aware when she was witnessing genuine cruelty disguised as academic engagement. Her position in Riverside High's social ecosystem was precarious in the way that often characterized genuinely intelligent students who prioritized learning over social status. She was respected for her academic achievements and appreciated for her willingness to help struggling classmates, but she lacked the combination of charisma, family wealth, and social media savvy that would have granted her entry into the upper tiers of teenage hierarchy. This marginalized status had given Rachel a unique perspective on the power dynamics that governed their advanced placement classes. She had observed how students like Jake Thompson used their intellectual gifts as weapons rather than tools for genuine learning, how Emma Rodriguez leveraged her social influence to control narrative and perception, and how Tyler Brooks and Madison Clark contributed their specialized skills to group efforts that often targeted anyone perceived as vulnerable or different. The targeting of substitute teachers had become a particular specialty of this group, refined over years of practice into a sophisticated system for establishing dominance over temporary authority figures. Rachel had witnessed previous campaigns that had driven substitutes from the classroom in tears, forced early departures, and in one memorable case, resulted in a complete nervous breakdown that had required administrative intervention. But something about the assault on Sarah Mitchell felt different to Rachel, more calculated and cruel than the typical testing of boundaries that characterized most substitute teacher interactions. The level of coordination, the systematic nature of the psychological pressure, and most disturbing, the obvious enjoyment that Jake and his friends derived from Sarah's visible distress, had crossed lines that Rachel found increasingly difficult to ignore. Her first instinct had been to offer indirect support, the kind of gentle assistance that might help Sarah navigate the curriculum without directly challenging the social dynamics that made intervention dangerous. Her suggestion that she help explain the symbolism they had been studying was an attempt to provide Sarah with academic backup while maintaining enough plausible deniability to avoid becoming a target herself. But as the campaign escalated and Sarah's distress became more apparent, Rachel found herself facing a moral dilemma that couldn't be resolved through indirect action. She was witnessing systematic psychological abuse being perpetrated by some of the most intelligent and privileged students in the school, and her continued silence was beginning to feel like complicity rather than prudent self-preservation. The moment that crystallized her decision came during the fifth period confrontation, when Jake had suggested that Sarah should call the principal because she was too incompetent to manage the classroom. The cruelty of the suggestion, delivered with just enough apparent concern to maintain plausible deniability, had finally pushed Rachel beyond her tolerance for passive observation. "Stop," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the laughter that had greeted Jake's mock-helpful suggestion. The word carried more authority than her usual soft-spoken contributions to class discussions, drawing attention from students who weren't accustomed to hearing Rachel challenge anyone directly. Jake turned toward her with the expression of someone genuinely surprised that anyone would dare interrupt his performance. His confidence was so complete, his sense of dominance so secure, that the possibility of resistance from someone like Rachel hadn't even occurred to him as a factor he needed to consider. "Excuse me," he said, his tone carrying just enough incredulity to suggest that Rachel must have misspoken or misunderstood something fundamental about the situation. "I said stop," Rachel repeated, her voice gaining strength as she committed to the confrontation she had been avoiding. "What you're doing to Ms. Mitchell isn't okay. It's cruel and it's wrong, and somebody needs to say that out loud." The silence that followed her declaration was different from the expectant quiet that had preceded Sarah's humiliation. This was the shocked silence of students who had just witnessed someone violate the unspoken rules that governed their social environment, someone who had chosen to defend the weak rather than align themselves with the strong. Emma Rodriguez was the first to respond, her social media instincts recognizing a potential threat to the narrative she had been carefully constructing. "Rachel, nobody's being cruel," she said, with the kind of patronizing concern that she might use with a younger sibling who had misunderstood adult conversation. "We're just asking legitimate questions about the curriculum." "No, you're not," Rachel replied, her academic training in rhetoric and analysis providing her with the tools to deconstruct their methods with precision. You're using sophisticated questions to expose knowledge gaps that you researched in advance. You're coordinating your attacks to maximize psychological pressure, and you're recording everything to create permanent documentation of her distress. Tyler Brooks attempted to diffuse the tension with humor, his usual strategy for situations that threaten to become too serious for comfort. Wow, Rachel, that's some pretty heavy analysis. Maybe you should consider a career in criminal psychology. The comment was designed to make her concerns seem overblown and melodramatic, but Rachel wasn't backing down. Actually, Tyler, what you're describing as humor is what psychologists call aggressive joking, using comedy to deliver hostile messages while maintaining plausible deniability. It's a form of psychological manipulation that's particularly effective in group settings. The precision with which she analyzed their methods stunned Jake and his friends into temporary silence. Rachel was using the same academic vocabulary and analytical frameworks that they had weaponized against Sarah, but she was turning those tools against them with devastating effectiveness. Madison Clark lowered her phone, suddenly uncertain whether she wanted to continue recording a confrontation that was rapidly moving beyond her control. The confident narrative of superior students exposing an incompetent teacher was being replaced by something much more complex and potentially damaging to her carefully curated online image. "You think you're so sophisticated," Rachel continued, her voice carrying the passion of someone who had finally found the courage to speak truth that had been building inside her for days. "You think your intelligence gives you the right to hurt people who can't fight back. But what you're really demonstrating is that you're bullies who happen to have good vocabularies." The word bullies hit the group like a physical blow, stripping away the academic pretensions and social justifications they had used to disguise their behavior from themselves and others. Rachel had identified the essential truth that all their sophistication couldn't obscure. They were using their gifts to cause pain rather than to create understanding. Jake's face had gone red with a combination of anger and shame, the color spreading up his neck as he processed the implications of Rachel's assessment. Emma's social media confidence was cracking as she realized that her carefully managed image might not survive a confrontation where she was characterized as a bully rather than a leader. But even as Rachel made her stand, even as she used her own intelligence to expose and challenge the psychological manipulation she had witnessed, she remained unaware of the most important factor in the equation. She didn't know that Sarah Mitchell had been carefully cataloging every word of the confrontation, analyzing not just the methods being used against her, but also the courage and moral clarity that Rachel was demonstrating in her defense. What Rachel couldn't have known was that her intervention was about to become the catalyst for a revelation that would transform everything she thought she understood about power, intelligence, and the substitute teacher she had chosen to defend. The transformation in Sarah Mitchell's demeanor had been gradual enough that the students in room 237 initially attributed it to normal variations in mood and energy, rather than recognizing it as the systematic shedding of a carefully constructed disguise. But as she stood before them, with Rachel Kim's words of defense still echoing in the air, something fundamental shifted in both her posture and her presence that made it impossible to ignore the change that was occurring. The nervous fidgeting that had characterized her movements for 2 days ceased entirely, replaced by the controlled stillness of someone comfortable with being the center of attention. Her breathing deepened and steadied, taking on the rhythm of someone preparing for action rather than enduring stress. Most noticeably, her voice when she finally spoke carried none of the uncertainty and defensiveness that had marked every previous interaction. "Rachel," Sarah said, and the quality of her voice made every student in the room look up from their phones with sudden attention. Thank you for your courage in speaking up. It takes genuine character to defend someone when you believe they can't defend themselves. The comment was delivered with such calm authority that it created cognitive dissonance in minds that had spent 2 days categorizing Sarah as weak and uncertain. This didn't sound like someone who needed defending. It sounded like someone who was perfectly capable of handling her own conflicts, but had chosen not to do so for reasons that were only now beginning to become apparent. Jake Thompson's confusion was visible as he tried to reconcile the woman standing before him with the nervous substitute teacher who had fumbled through lesson plans and stuttered through explanations just moments earlier. Something fundamental had changed, but his mind couldn't quite process what he was witnessing because it contradicted everything he had observed and everything he believed about the situation. "Ms. Mitchell," Emma Rodriguez said hesitantly, her social media instincts warning her that the narrative she had been constructing was about to be completely overturned by developments she hadn't anticipated. The confident tone she had used throughout their campaign was replaced by genuine uncertainty as she processed the transformation occurring before her eyes. Tyler Brooks found himself uncharacteristically quiet, his usual stream of commentary drying up as his comedian's instincts warned him that the mood in the room had shifted beyond the point where humor would be appropriate or welcome. The nervous substitute teacher who had been such an easy target was being replaced by someone whose presence commanded a very different kind of attention. Madison Clark's phone remained pointed toward the front of the classroom, but her expression had shifted from anticipation to confusion as she realized that whatever she was recording no longer matched the story she had expected to capture. The vulnerable woman being destroyed by superior students was transforming into something that didn't fit any of her established content categories. "I want you all to understand something," Sarah continued, and now her voice carried the kind of authority that made people listen without quite understanding why. The transformation was complete. The stammering, uncertain woman was gone, replaced by someone whose very presence changed the energy of the room in ways that triggered instinctive recognition of genuine power. "For the past 2 days, you have provided me with a comprehensive demonstration of coordinated psychological manipulation techniques that I recognize from my previous career. Jake, your systematic probing for intellectual weaknesses while maintaining academic legitimacy. Emma, your social dynamics management and reputation control. Tyler, your weaponized humor designed to provide social permission for cruelty. Madison, your documentation strategy for creating permanent evidence of humiliation." The clinical precision with which she analyzed their methods had a visible impact on each student she named. They were hearing their tactics described with professional vocabulary that suggested knowledge and experience far beyond anything they had imagined their substitute teacher might possess. "But here's what you failed to consider," Sarah said, her tone taking on the quality of someone delivering a professional assessment rather than a personal defense. "Intelligence without wisdom is not strength. It's a dangerous vulnerability that can be exploited by anyone with sufficient training and experience." Jake's face had gone pale as he processed the implications of Sarah's words. The confidence that had carried him through 2 days of systematic psychological manipulation was evaporating as he began to understand that he might have seriously misjudged the situation. The nervous substitute teacher who had seemed so easy to intimidate was revealing herself to be something entirely different. Each question you asked, each taunt you delivered, every moment of supposed victory you savored provided me with valuable intelligence about how you operate, how you think, and most importantly, what you believe gives you power, Sarah continued, her voice remaining perfectly controlled despite the gravity of what she was revealing. Emma's phone was now completely lowered, her social media instincts screaming warnings about reputation management, as she realized that whatever was happening might not be something she wanted preserved or associated with her online image. The carefully curated persona she maintained across multiple platforms suddenly felt very fragile. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has extensive training programs for dealing with individuals who believe their intelligence makes them untouchable, Sarah said, and the words fell into the silence of room 237 like stones into a deep well. White-collar criminals, corporate executives, organized crime figures who think their sophistication places them above ordinary law enforcement. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words carried implications that the students were only beginning to process, suggesting that their substitute teacher possessed credentials and experience that went far beyond anything they had imagined. The nervous woman who had fumbled through literary analysis was revealing herself to be someone with training in areas they couldn't even comprehend. Tyler Brooks was the first to find his voice, though it came out smaller and less confident than his usual classroom contributions. "Are you saying you're FBI?" he asked, the question carrying the tone of someone hoping they had misunderstood something fundamental. Sarah's smile was slight but unmistakable, carrying the satisfaction of someone who had successfully maintained a difficult cover until the moment when revelation would have maximum impact. "Former FBI," she corrected gently. 15 years as a senior interrogator specializing in psychological manipulation and criminal psychology. "I resigned 3 years ago to pursue more meaningful work in education." The revelation hit the students like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything they had experienced over the past 2 days in ways that made them question not just Sarah's identity, but their own judgment and perceptions. The vulnerable substitute teacher they had been tormenting was actually a trained federal agent who had spent years dealing with criminals far more sophisticated than high school students. Rachel Kim sat forward in her seat, her academic instincts recognizing that whatever was about to happen would be more educational than anything covered in Peterson's curriculum. She had defended Sarah believing she was protecting someone vulnerable, only to discover that she had been defending someone perfectly capable of protecting herself. Madison Clark stared at her phone with the expression of someone who had just realized that her recorded evidence might actually be evidence against herself rather than against her target. Everything she had captured over the past 2 days suddenly took on very different implications when viewed through the lens of Sarah's actual background and capabilities. "The question you need to ask yourselves now," Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone of someone presenting a challenge rather than delivering a threat, "is what happens next. Because this moment, this exact moment, is when you decide whether you learn from this experience or whether you double down on behaviors that have just been revealed as both ineffective and morally bankrupt." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of autumn wind against the windows and the distant noise of other classes proceeding normally throughout Riverside High School. The 30 seconds that would later be remembered, as the moment everything changed at Riverside High School began with what appeared to be a simple question about respect. Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still in the center of room 237, her transformation from nervous substitute to confident professional complete. But her next move carefully calculated to provide maximum educational impact without crossing into abuse of her position. "Jake," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to controlling situations far more volatile than a high school classroom, "I want you to stand up and repeat exactly what you said about calling the principal, because I was too incompetent to manage this class." The request was delivered without hostility or obvious threat, but something in Sarah's tone made it clear that this wasn't actually a request at all. Jake Thompson found himself rising from his seat, despite every instinct screaming that he should refuse, that he should maintain some shred of the defiance that had carried him through 2 days of systematic psychological manipulation. I said, maybe you should call the principal if you weren't comfortable teaching the class, Jake managed, his voice lacking the confident authority that had characterized his previous interactions. Standing while Sarah remained perfectly composed and in control created a physical dynamic that emphasized his sudden vulnerability rather than any position of strength. "And why did you suggest that?" Sarah asked, her tone remaining conversational despite the devastating precision of her questioning. She was using techniques perfected in federal interrogation rooms, allowing Jake to incriminate himself through his own words rather than imposing judgment from outside. Jake's pause stretched uncomfortably long as he processed the trap he had walked into. Every answer he could give would force him to admit either that he had been deliberately cruel or that he had seriously misjudged the situation. The confident young man who had orchestrated a sophisticated psychological campaign was being reduced to stammering uncertainty by someone whose training in these dynamics far exceeded his own. Because I thought you weren't qualified to teach the class," he said finally, the admission hanging in the air like a confession. "Based on what evidence?" Sarah pressed, her questions following the logical progression that had made her one of the FBI's most effective interrogators. She wasn't attacking Jake directly. She was simply asking him to explain his reasoning in a way that would reveal the assumptions and prejudices underlying his behavior. Your educational background," Jake replied weakly, his voice growing smaller as he began to understand how his answers were exposing the shallow foundation of his supposed intellectual superiority. "My community college degree?" Sarah asked, with the slight smile of someone who had anticipated exactly this response. "Tell me, Jake, what does my educational background have to do with my qualifications to substitute teach an advanced placement literature class for 1 week?" The question was a masterpiece of misdirection, appearing to address Jake's stated concerns while actually forcing him to confront the elitist assumptions that had driven his behavior. He found himself unable to articulate an answer that didn't reveal his own prejudices about class, education, and social status. Emma Rodriguez watched this systematic deconstruction with growing horror, recognizing that Jake was being professionally dismantled by someone whose skills in psychological manipulation far exceeded their own. Her social media instincts warned her that whatever was being captured on the multiple recording devices in the room might not be content she wanted associated with her online presence. I don't know," Jake admitted finally, the words carrying the weight of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged in ways he couldn't navigate or control. "You don't know," Sarah repeated gently, allowing the admission to resonate throughout the classroom. "So you systematically undermined someone's authority, coordinated a campaign of psychological manipulation, and suggested they were too incompetent to perform their job, all based on assumptions you can't actually justify." Tyler Brooks found himself unable to contribute his usual commentary, his comedian's instincts warning him that the mood in the room had moved far beyond the point where humor would be appropriate. The confident group that had dominated room 237 for 2 days was being systematically dismantled by someone whose training in these dynamics exceeded anything they had imagined possible. Madison Clark continued recording, but her expression had shifted from anticipation to genuine fear as she realized that everything she had captured might actually constitute evidence of coordinated harassment rather than the entertaining content she had planned to create. The narrative she had expected to construct was being completely overturned by developments she hadn't anticipated. "Emma," Sarah said, turning her attention to the next member of their group with the precise timing of someone orchestrating a carefully planned revelation. "I want you to explain to the class how you used your social media influence to amplify the psychological pressure Jake was creating." Emma's face went pale as she realized that Sarah had been analyzing not just their individual methods, but the sophisticated way they had coordinated their efforts to maximize impact. The casual confidence she had maintained throughout their campaign evaporated as she understood that her techniques had been catalogued and could be exposed with professional precision. "I was just asking questions about the curriculum," Emma said weakly, her usual social media sophistication failing her completely when faced with someone trained in actual psychological manipulation rather than teenage social dynamics. Questions carefully timed to coincide with Jake's intellectual challenges, designed to create social permission for mockery, and coordinated with Tyler's humor and Madison's documentation strategy. Sarah replied with the clinical precision of someone delivering a professional assessment. "That's not asking questions, Emma. That's orchestrating a psychological assault." The words hit Emma like a physical blow, stripping away the social justifications and academic pretenses they had used to disguise their behavior from themselves and others. Sarah was describing their actions with the kind of professional vocabulary typically reserved for criminal psychology textbooks, and the implications were devastating. Rachel Kim found herself taking notes despite the emotional intensity of what was unfolding, her academic instincts recognizing that she was witnessing a masterclass in psychological analysis and intervention. The systematic way Sarah was deconstructing the manipulation techniques she had observed was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. "Tyler," Sarah continued, her attention shifting to the class comedian with the relentless focus of someone who intended to address every participant in the coordinated campaign against her. "Explain to everyone how weaponized humor works as a psychological manipulation technique." Tyler's usual quick wit abandoned him entirely as he processed the implications of Sarah's question. His comedy had always been his shield and his weapon, allowing him to say things that would be inappropriate from anyone else while maintaining the defense that he was just joking. But Sarah was asking him to analyze his own methods in a way that would expose their true purpose. "I was just trying to keep things light," Tyler said lamely, his voice lacking any of the confidence that typically characterized his classroom contributions. "By making jokes at the expense of someone you perceived as vulnerable," Sarah clarified with devastating precision. "By using humor to provide social permission for cruelty while maintaining plausible deniability about your own role in causing harm." Tyler's face flushed red as he realized that his carefully cultivated image as the harmless class entertainer was being systematically dismantled by someone who understood exactly how his techniques worked and why they were effective. "Madison," Sarah said, turning to the final member of their group with the inevitable progression of someone following a predetermined plan, "tell the class about your documentation strategy and how you plan to monetize Sarah Mitchell's humiliation." Madison's phone slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor as she processed the accuracy of Sarah's assessment. Everything she had recorded, every moment she had captured, every piece of content she had planned to create was being recontextualized as evidence of coordinated harassment rather than entertaining social media material. "I was just recording for educational purposes," Madison whispered, her voice barely audible as she realized how hollow her justification sounded when analyzed by someone with actual expertise in psychological manipulation. "Educational purposes?" Sarah repeated with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Like the education you're all receiving right now about the difference between intelligence and wisdom, between academic achievement and actual character. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of autumn wind against the windows and the distant noise of other classes proceeding normally throughout Riverside High School. But in room 237, everything had changed in 30 seconds that felt like hours, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The 4 students who had entered the room that morning as confident manipulators had been systematically reduced to stammering uncertainty by someone whose training and experience in these dynamics far exceeded their own. Their sophisticated psychological campaign had been analyzed, deconstructed, and exposed with professional precision that left them no room for denial or justification. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't finished. The lesson she was delivering required one final component that would transform this moment from temporary humiliation into lasting change in perspective. Sarah Mitchell moved to the center of the classroom with the fluid confidence of someone finally operating in their natural element, no longer constrained by the limiting persona she had maintained for 2 days. The transformation was so complete that several students would later claim they were looking at a completely different person, someone whose very presence commanded attention and respect in ways that transcended traditional authority structures. "I want you to understand exactly what has been happening in this room," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone delivering a professional briefing rather than a classroom lecture. "For the past 2 days, you have been providing me with a comprehensive case study in coordinated psychological manipulation that I will use in future training programs for educators facing similar challenges." The implications of her words began to sink in as the students realized they had essentially been unknowing participants in a professional research project. Their sophisticated campaign against what they had believed was a vulnerable substitute teacher had actually been observed, analyzed, and documented by someone whose expertise in these areas far exceeded their own. "Jake, your systematic probing for intellectual vulnerabilities while maintaining academic legitimacy is a technique I've encountered in corporate boardrooms during white-collar crime investigations. The executives who thought their MBA credentials made them immune to questioning used remarkably similar approaches when trying to establish dominance over federal agents they perceived as intellectually inferior." Jake's face went ashen as he processed the comparison between his behavior and that of white-collar criminals. The sophisticated intellectual manipulation he had been so proud of was being characterized as a technique used by people facing federal investigation, and the implications were devastating to his self-image. "Emma, your social dynamics management and reputation control strategies mirror techniques used by organized crime figures who understood that perception management was crucial to maintaining power structures. The way you orchestrated group responses and amplified psychological pressure shows sophisticated understanding of crowd psychology, but applied for destructive rather than constructive purposes." Emma's carefully maintained composure cracked entirely as she realized that her social media skills were being compared to criminal manipulation techniques. The influence she had worked so hard to cultivate was being recontextualized as something far more sinister than she had ever intended. Tyler weaponized humor as a delivery system for psychological assault is a well-documented technique in both criminal psychology and domestic abuse literature. The ability to deliver hostile messages while maintaining plausible deniability through comedy is particularly effective because it makes victims appear oversensitive when they object to the treatment they're receiving. Tyler's reputation as the harmless class entertainer collapsed entirely as he understood that his comedy was being analyzed through the lens of abuse psychology. The jokes that had always been his strength were being revealed as weapons he hadn't even realized he was wielding. Madison, your documentation strategy for creating permanent evidence of humiliation that could be distributed across social media platforms represents a sophisticated understanding of how digital harassment campaigns operate. The promise of educational content was simply a pretext for gathering material that could be weaponized against your target. Madison's phone lay forgotten on the floor as she processed the realization that her content creation strategy was being characterized as digital harassment. Everything she had recorded with the intention of entertaining her followers was being revealed as evidence of coordinated psychological assault. "But here's what I want you to really understand," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a tone that commanded absolute attention. Each of these techniques individually represents sophisticated psychological manipulation that would be illegal in many adult contexts. Coordinated together with careful documentation and distribution strategies, they constitute the kind of systematic harassment that federal law enforcement takes very seriously. The classroom had become completely silent, with even Rachel. Kim's note-taking ceased as she processed the gravity of what Sarah was revealing. The sophisticated campaign that Jake and his friends had been so proud of was being systematically dismantled and recontextualized in ways that made its true nature undeniable. "The reason I know these techniques so well," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of years of professional experience, "is that I spent 15 years as a senior FBI interrogator, specializing in cases involving exactly these kinds of psychological manipulation strategies. I've seen corporate executives, organized crime figures, and domestic abusers use remarkably similar approaches to establish dominance over people they perceived as vulnerable." The revelation that had been building throughout her analysis finally crystallized into full understanding. Their substitute teacher wasn't just someone with unexpected knowledge about psychological manipulation. She was a trained federal agent whose professional expertise had been developed specifically to deal with people who used intelligence and sophistication to cause harm. "My resignation from the Bureau 3 years ago was voluntary," Sarah continued, anticipating questions that several students were forming but couldn't quite bring themselves to ask. "I left because I wanted to use my skills constructively rather than spending my time prosecuting people who had chosen to use their gifts destructively. Education seemed like a natural transition, a way to help young people understand the difference between intelligence and wisdom before they made choices that would define their character permanently." Jake Thompson found his voice, though. It came out smaller and less confident than any of his previous classroom contributions. "So, everything that happened, you were in control the whole time?" Sarah's smile was slight but unmistakable, carrying the satisfaction of someone who had successfully maintained a difficult operation until the moment when revelation would have maximum educational impact. "From the moment I walked into this classroom, every interaction we had provided me with intelligence about your methods, your coordination strategies, and most importantly, your psychological profiles. You were never manipulating me, Jake. You were revealing yourselves to someone trained to catalog and analyze exactly the kind of behavior you were demonstrating." Emma's voice was barely a whisper when she finally managed to speak. The nervousness, the fumbling with lesson plans, not knowing the answers to our questions. "Performance," Sarah confirmed gently. 15 years of undercover work teaches you to become whatever your targets expect to see. You expected to see a nervous, underqualified substitute teacher, so that's exactly what I showed you. Every tremor in my hands, every uncertain pause, every moment of apparent confusion was carefully calculated to encourage you to reveal more about how you operate." Tyler Brooks looked like he was going to be sick as he processed the implications of Sarah's revelation. "So when we thought we were winning, you were losing," Sarah finished for him. "Every moment you thought you were establishing dominance, you were actually providing me with more evidence of coordinated harassment, more examples of psychological manipulation techniques, and more insight into the kind of character flaws that lead intelligent people to use their gifts destructively." Madison Clark stared at her phone on the floor with the expression of someone who had just realized that all her carefully planned content had actually been evidence against herself rather than entertainment for her followers. The recording will be shared with the school administration, your parents, and potentially with law enforcement if this pattern of behavior continues, Sarah said matter-of-factly. Not as punishment, but as educational material to help adults understand how sophisticated teenage harassment campaigns have become and why traditional anti-bullying approaches are often inadequate to address them. The weight of consequences began to settle over the 4 students who had spent 2 days believing they were untouchable. Their sophisticated methods, their careful coordination, their assumption that their intelligence made them immune to accountability, all of it was crumbling under the analysis of someone whose professional training had prepared her to deal with far more dangerous opponents. Rachel Kim raised her hand with the tentative gesture of someone still processing everything she had witnessed. "Ms. Mitchell, when you said you left the FBI to work in education, is this why? To deal with situations like this?" Sarah's expression softened as she looked at the student who had demonstrated genuine courage by defending someone she believed was vulnerable. "Partly, Rachel, but also because I believe that moments like this one, moments when intelligent young people are forced to confront the difference between using their gifts constructively versus destructively, are when real character development happens. You can't teach wisdom through textbooks. You can only create opportunities for people to choose who they want to become." The silence that followed was different from the stunned quiet that had characterized most of the revelation. This was the contemplative silence of people processing fundamental changes in their understanding of themselves and their choices, the kind of quiet that preceded either genuine growth or deeper entrenchment in destructive patterns. Sarah looked at each of the students who had participated in the campaign against her, her expression carrying neither anger nor judgment, but rather the professional assessment of someone evaluating whether her intervention had achieved its intended educational objectives. "The question you need to answer now," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone presenting a final challenge, "is what you do with this knowledge. Because this moment, this exact moment, is when you decide whether you learn from this experience or whether you simply become more sophisticated in hiding behaviors that you now understand are fundamentally wrong." The silence that followed Sarah's revelation stretched for what felt like hours, but was actually less than a minute, broken finally by the sound of Madison Clark retrieving her phone from the floor with trembling fingers. The device that had been her weapon for documenting Sarah's supposed inadequacy now felt like evidence of her own moral failure, and she couldn't quite bring herself to look at the screen that had captured everything. Jake Thompson remained standing where Sarah had positioned him, but his posture had completely changed from the confident authority he had projected throughout their campaign. His shoulders had rounded inward, his head was slightly bowed, and his hands hung at his sides with the defeated gesture of someone whose entire understanding of his own power had been systematically dismantled. Emma Rodriguez sat frozen in her seat, her social media instincts paralyzed by the realization that no amount of careful image management could undo what had just been revealed about her character. The influence she had cultivated so carefully across multiple platforms suddenly felt meaningless when weighed against the mirror Sarah had held up to show her true nature. Tyler Brooks had gone completely silent. His usual stream of commentary dried up as he processed the comparison between his comedy and psychological abuse techniques, the reputation that had always protected him, the harmless entertainer who kept everyone laughing, had been exposed as a carefully constructed defense for behavior that was anything but harmless. Rachel Kim found herself in the unexpected position of being the student who had acted with the most integrity throughout the entire ordeal, and the weight of that realization was almost as overwhelming as her relief that Sarah hadn't actually needed her protection. Her notes from the confrontation had transformed from academic observations into a detailed record of one of the most sophisticated interventions she had ever witnessed. The power dynamics in room 237 had shifted so completely that it felt like a different classroom entirely. Where Jake and his friends had once held absolute social dominance, they now sat in stunned recognition of how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered by someone whose expertise in psychological manipulation far exceeded their own. Sarah moved back behind Peterson's desk, but her posture remained that of someone in complete control rather than someone hiding behind authority symbols. She gathered the lesson plan binder that had served as a prop for her performance, and several students noticed that her movements were now completely steady, lacking any trace of the nervousness that had characterized her previous interactions. "I think," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had successfully completed a difficult mission, "that we've covered enough literature for today. You have some thinking to do about the choices you've made and the people you want to become." The dismissal was gentle but absolute, carrying the weight of someone whose authority was no longer in question. But instead of the relief that usually accompanied early dismissal from class, the students felt the particular discomfort that came from being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Jake finally found his voice, though it carried none of the confidence that had marked his previous contributions to classroom discussions. "Ms. Mitchell, what happens now? Are you going to report us to the administration?" Sarah's expression was thoughtful as she considered the question, weighing her response with the care of someone who understood that her next words could significantly impact the trajectory of these students' lives. "That depends entirely on what happens next, Jake. This experience can be the beginning of genuine character development, or it can be the moment when you decide to become more sophisticated in hiding destructive behavior. The choice is yours." Emma's voice was barely audible when she finally managed to speak. "We thought we were so smart. We thought we had everything figured out." "You are smart," Sarah replied, her tone carrying neither condescension nor false reassurance. "That's what makes your choices so significant. Intelligent people have the capacity to cause tremendous harm when they use their gifts without wisdom. But they also have the capacity to do tremendous good when they understand the responsibility that comes with their abilities." Tyler Brooks looked up from the desk, where he had been staring at his hands, his expression carrying a vulnerability that none of his classmates had ever seen before. How do we fix this? How do we become better than what we were?" The question surprised Sarah, with its apparent sincerity representing the kind of genuine reflection that she had hoped her intervention might inspire. "You start by acknowledging the harm you've caused, not just to me, but to every substitute teacher you've targeted, every student you've intimidated, every person you've used your intelligence to diminish rather than elevate." Madison Clark finally looked up from her phone, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she processed the full implications of what she had participated in. "I recorded everything. I was going to make it into content for my followers. I was going to make money from humiliating you. And now you understand why that was wrong," Sarah replied gently. "Understanding is the first step toward making different choices. The question is whether you'll apply that understanding consistently or only when you're caught." "Rachel, Kim raised her hand with the tentative gesture of someone still processing everything she had witnessed. "Ms. Mitchell, will you still be our substitute teacher for the rest of the week?" Sarah's smile was genuine as she looked at the student who had demonstrated courage and integrity throughout the ordeal. "If you'd like me to be, Rachel. But it will be very different from the past 2 days. You'll be learning from someone who has dropped the act and is prepared to challenge you academically and intellectually in ways that might be uncomfortable." The prospect of facing Sarah Mitchell without her protective disguise of incompetence was both terrifying and oddly appealing to students who had rarely encountered adults capable of matching their intellectual sophistication while maintaining clear moral authority. Jake straightened slightly, some small portion of his confidence returning as he processed the opportunity Sarah was offering. "What would that look like? Learning from you, I mean. It would look like applying your analytical skills to literature that explores complex moral questions, rather than using those same skills to tear down people you perceive as vulnerable," Sarah replied. "It would mean discussing how intelligence can be used constructively versus destructively, using examples from both fiction and real life." Emma found herself genuinely interested, despite her embarrassment and shame. "You mean like analyzing characters who make choices similar to what we've been doing?" "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "Literature is full of intelligent characters who choose to use their gifts for harm rather than good. Understanding their motivations and the consequences of their choices might help you make better decisions about your own behavior." Tyler's comedian instincts began to stir as he realized that Sarah might actually be offering them something more valuable than the easy dominance they had sought. "And you'd teach us about psychological manipulation, like the legitimate study of it. If you're genuinely interested in understanding how these techniques work and why they're effective, yes," Sarah said, "but with the understanding that knowledge comes with responsibility, and that using these techniques to harm others would be completely unacceptable." Madison looked up from her phone with an expression that mixed hope with uncertainty. "What about the recording? What about everything I captured?" Sarah's expression was thoughtful as she considered the question. "That content could actually be valuable, Madison. Not as entertainment, but as educational material to help other students understand how sophisticated harassment campaigns develop and why they're so harmful. The question is whether you're mature enough to help create something constructive from what you intended to be destructive." The offer was unexpected and generous, providing a path toward redemption that none of the students had anticipated. Instead of simply facing consequences for their behavior, they were being offered the opportunity to use their experience constructively, to transform their mistakes into learning opportunities for others. The bell that marked the end of fifth period rang with perfect timing, providing a natural conclusion to a confrontation that had transformed everyone present in ways they were only beginning to understand. As students began to gather their belongings, the energy in room 237 felt completely different from anything they had experienced during their time at Riverside High School. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.